10 years ago, you could barely book a hotel room in these cities. Not anymore. Across Europe, something has shifted quietly, systematically, and in ways that the tourism boards and travel magazines refuse to acknowledge. Cities that once defined the very concept of a destination. Places that appeared on every bucket list, every honeymoon itinerary, every you have to go before you die article they are emptying out. Not dramatically, not with headlines, just quietly. The way all great things begin to end. Visitor numbers down, hotels converting to apartments, souvenir shops replaced by convenience stores serving the people who actually live there, the few who remain. Walking streets that once required negotiating through crowds now offer something nobody asked for: space. This is not a travel guide. We are not going to tell you where to eat or what to see. What we are going to show you is something the tourism industry spends billions of euros every year trying to hide. The pattern underneath the postcards. The silence behind the skyline. If you have been watching Europe carefully, you already sense something was wrong. The prices going up. The quality going down. The feeling that something essential had left, even if you could not name what it was. You were not imagining it, and you were not alone. If you want to understand how the greatest cities in the world quietly stop being great before the rest of the world catches on, subscribe. Empire Falls documents the decline that mainstream media is not paid to cover. What we are about to show you spans 10 European capitals. Some are famous, some are beloved, all of them are losing something they cannot get back, and the pattern connecting all of them is more unsettling than any one city's story alone. We begin not with the most dramatic case, but with one that should have been impossible. Prague was, for roughly 2 decades, the jewel of Central European tourism. It had everything a city needs to become legendary medieval architecture intact, because the 20th century's worst moments largely spared it. A river cutting through the old city like something from a fairy tale, beer cheaper than water, and a cultural weight that dated back to the Bohemian kings. In the 90s and early 2000s, Prague was the city young Europeans and Americans discovered and never stopped talking about. Stag parties, art residencies, film productions, writers, photographers. Everyone went to Prague. Then something changed. It did not change because Prague became less beautiful. The Charles Bridge is still there. The castle still rises above the Vltava every morning. What changed was the composition of the city underneath the postcard. By the mid-2010s, the old town had been so thoroughly colonized by tourism infrastructure that the actual city, the one where Praguers live, work, eat, argue about politics, had retreated entirely from its own historic center. Locals stopped going to the center not because they disliked it, but because there was nothing left for them there. Every restaurant was a tourist trap. Every bar was priced for someone on a stag weekend. Every shop sold amber jewelry or Franz Kafka mugs. What the tourism industry sold as Prague was a stage set. And increasingly, even tourists began to notice the hollowness behind it. By 2023, visitor numbers in the Czech capital had recovered from the pandemic on paper, but the profile of those visitors had shifted dramatically. The long-stay cultural visitors, the ones who spent money in galleries and independent restaurants and came back year after year, had largely stopped coming. What remained was high-volume, low-spend day-trip tourism, primarily from Western European budget airline routes, and a stag party economy that local businesses simultaneously depend on and resent. A city that once defined romantic European travel now defines something closer to a theme park operating in a historic shell. The city did not die loudly. It died quietly, the way all cities do: one local business replaced by a souvenir shop, one real resident priced out, one authentic street corner converted into a photo opportunity. But Prague is not the most instructive case. The most instructive case, the one that reveals the deeper pattern, is Athens. Athens did something unusual. It became 2 cities simultaneously, and neither one of them fully worked. For decades, Athens suffered a reputational problem that had nothing to do with its actual assets. The Acropolis, the oldest continuously inhabited urban landscape in Western civilization, the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, tragedy as an art form. All of it was somehow not enough to make Athens a city people wanted to stay in, rather than pass through. Tourists came for 3 days, saw the ancient sites, and left for the islands. The city itself, Monastiraki, Syri, Exarchia, Kolonaki, existed in a kind of permanent underappreciation. Then came the financial crisis, and something strange happened. As Greece collapsed economically through the 2010s, Athens became briefly fashionable in the way that only devastated cities can be. Rents dropped to almost nothing. Artists, young Europeans with no money but ambition, digital nomads before that phrase existed, began arriving. There was a genuine cultural renaissance in neighborhoods that had been considered dangerous or irrelevant. For a short window, Athens had something that cannot be manufactured: authenticity born from economic necessity. That window closed. The same forces that had transformed Lisbon and Porto, that were beginning to hollow out Tbilisi and Tirana, arrived in Athens with the efficiency of a pattern that has now repeated itself across dozens of cities. Short-term rental platforms converted entire apartment blocks. Property investment from Northern and Western European buyers pushed rents beyond what locals could pay. The neighborhoods that had become interesting because local people lived and created in them began losing those local people. And as the local people left, the thing that had made the neighborhoods interesting left with them. What remains in much of central Athens today is a city in a peculiar kind of limbo, too expensive for the locals who made it vibrant. Not expensive enough, not polished enough, not safe enough in the perception of mainstream tourism to compete with Barcelona or Rome for the mass market, caught between two identities and fully inhabiting neither. A former tourism consultant who worked with the Greek Ministry of Culture described it, without attribution, as a city that kept selling its past while accidentally destroying its present. That description is worth sitting with, because it applies to more than Athens. The pattern we are tracing: grandeur sold, authenticity destroyed, tourists sensing the hollowness, tourists leaving repeats with remarkable consistency across the continent. And nowhere does it repeat more visibly, more painfully, or with more historical irony than in Venice. Venice is not quietly dying. Venice has been loudly, publicly, documented, in every newspaper dying for 30 years. And yet it continues to be the clearest illustration of a phenomenon that is now infecting cities that do not yet understand what is happening to them. In 1950, Venice had a residential population of approximately 175,000 people. Today, in the historic center of the city built on water, fewer than 50,000 permanent residents remain. The number continues to fall by roughly 1,000 people per year. The city is not losing tourists. In 2019, before the pandemic, Venice received approximately 13 million visitors. It is losing the thing that made tourists want to come in the first place: the fact that it was a living city. What Venice has become is the most sophisticated ghost town in human history. The facades are impeccable. The canals still reflect the palazzos exactly as they do in every photograph you have ever seen. But behind those facades, the actual mechanics of urban life have largely ceased to function. Schools close because there are not enough children. Hospitals reduce services because there are not enough patients. Pharmacies and grocery stores, the infrastructure of daily existence, have been replaced by gelato stands and glass-blowing demonstrations. Locals have a word for the tourists who flood the narrow streets: grandi navi, big ships. Not because of the cruise ships themselves, though those were a genuine catastrophe, but because of the way mass tourism moves through a city like a vessel displacing water. Everything genuine gets pushed to the edges, and the edges of Venice are the mainland, which is where Venetians now live. The city did not fail to preserve its architecture. It failed to preserve the thing architecture is supposed to shelter: actual human life. This is the warning that the cities further down this list have not yet fully understood. But here, we need to take a step back, because the story of European tourism decline is not only a story about what tourism did to cities. It is also a story about what cities did to themselves, the choices made, the warnings ignored, the short-term revenues prioritized over long-term identity. The next city on our list made a choice that seemed rational at every individual step and produced a result that nobody wanted. Barcelona had, by any measure, everything. Mediterranean climate, architectural genius, in the form of Gaudi's unfinished cathedral, rising above the skyline like a permanent provocation. A waterfront reclaimed from industrial decay, a food culture of genuine seriousness, a language, Catalan, that gave the city a distinct identity within Spain and a sense of fierce local pride that tourists found magnetic. Barcelona, in the 1990s and 2000s, was perhaps the most successful urban regeneration story in modern Europe. The 1992 Olympics were the inflection point. The city remade its waterfront, constructed infrastructure, presented itself to the world, and the world arrived, and then kept arriving, and then kept arriving. By the late 2010s, Barcelona was receiving over 32 million visitors a year in a city of 1.6 million permanent residents. That ratio, 20 visitors for every resident, is not a tourism economy. It is an occupation. And the residents began to describe it in exactly those terms. Graffiti appeared on the walls of the Gothic quarter. Tourists go home. Not a fringe sentiment. A reflection of something that surveys of Barcelona residents confirmed with uncomfortable clarity. A majority of locals believed that tourism had made their city worse to live in, not better. Rents in central neighborhoods had increased by over 40% in less than a decade. Bars where locals had drunk for generations became cocktail destinations for Instagram. The Ramblas, once the civic artery of the city, became a corridor of pickpockets and mediocre paella. And then something unexpected happened. Tourists started leaving too, not in the numbers that locals would have hoped for, but the composition shifted. The visitors who came to Barcelona for its cultural depth, for its architecture, its music, its food culture, its museums began choosing other destinations. What grew was the lowest margin tourism, weekend party breaks, cruise ship day trippers, budget airline passengers, who contributed relatively little, economically and disproportionately to the sense of overcrowding. The city was simultaneously over-touristed, and by the measures that actually matter for a city's soul, under-visited. The mayor of Barcelona declared a moratorium on new tourist apartments in 2024, an acknowledgement, finally, of a problem that had been visible for 15 years. Whether it is too late is a question that urban economists are arguing about with increasing urgency. If patterns like this fascinate you, if you find yourself sensing that something larger is moving through these stories, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm to keep this kind of investigation alive. We are now past the halfway point of our list, and the cases become more complicated, more interesting, and in some ways more troubling. Because so far we have been describing cities that were overwhelmed by their own success. What follows are cities that were abandoned for something harder to name. Bruges was once described as the Venice of the North. Before Venice became a cautionary tale, that was a compliment. Bruges has canals, medieval architecture, a preserved historic center so intact that it was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2000. For a city of 120,000 people, it received a staggering 8 million visitors a year in its peak years. A city center the size of a few city blocks, absorbing crowds that would challenge a metropolis. What happened to Bruges is subtler than what happened to Barcelona or Venice. It did not have a political crisis, a rent explosion, a collapse of local identity. What it had was something quieter. A gradual recognition among a certain kind of traveler that the city had become a museum of itself. There is a type of tourist who travels to understand something about history, about architecture, about how people live differently. And there is a type of tourist who travels to consume an experience, to photograph it, to confirm that they have been somewhere. Bruges, in its careful preservation and its chocolate shop to resident ratio, began attracting almost exclusively the second type. The first type moved on to cities that still had friction, uncertainty, the feeling that something real was happening somewhere slightly out of frame. A British travel journalist, who had written about Bruges twice, once in 2005 and once in 2022, described the difference in terms that deserve to be quoted. In 2005, you could lose yourself there. In 2022, there was nowhere left to get lost. That sentence describes something precise about what tourism, at scale, does to the texture of a city. It smooths everything. It removes the edges. And edges, it turns out, are what make a place feel real. Lisbon tells a version of this story that is perhaps the most emotionally complex on our list, because Lisbon was, for a moment, the underdog triumph of European urbanism. Portugal's capital spent decades in a kind of productive obscurity. While Paris and Rome and Barcelona competed for tourists and prices, Lisbon remained comparatively affordable, comparatively quiet, comparatively authentic. The hills, the trams, the fado music drifting from restaurants that existed for locals, not visitors. The light, the specific quality of Atlantic light that painters have been trying to capture for centuries. Lisbon had an atmosphere that could not be replicated. Then the word got out. Roughly between 2015 and 2020, Lisbon became the most recommended city in Europe among the kind of traveler who considers themselves sophisticated enough to have moved on from Paris. The boutique hotels arrived. The Airbnb listings multiplied. The digital nomad community descended, attracted by relatively low costs and high quality of life. The Golden Visa program drew property investment from across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. Within 5 years, Lisbon had become exactly what its visitors had been fleeing. Rents in Alfama, the ancient Moorish neighborhood that had been home to working-class Lisbonites for generations, increased by over 60% in a decade. The fado restaurants that had served locals became fado restaurants that charged tourists €30 for a glass of wine and a performance calibrated for people who do not know what fado is. The trams, once functional public transportation, became tourist attractions too crowded for residents to actually use. Portugal ended the Golden Visa program for residential properties in 2023, a measure that many economists regarded as closing the stable door after the horse had not just left, but had bought the neighboring stable and converted it into short-term rentals. The Lisbonites, who were priced out of their own city, did not go quietly. They organized, protested, generated international press coverage. They were articulate about what was being lost. And in being articulate about it, they inadvertently made Lisbon more famous, which drew more visitors, which accelerated the process they were protesting against. There is a cruelty in that dynamic that echoes through every city on this list. But the cruelty has a different face in the cities that experience decline not from too many visitors, but from too few. Riga, the capital of Latvia, is a city that most people outside the Baltic states could not locate on a map with confidence. That is partly the point. Riga is one of the great Art Nouveau cities of Europe. A UNESCO heritage designation covers over 800 buildings from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a concentration of that architectural style found nowhere else on the continent. The old town is medieval and immaculately preserved. The food scene that developed in the 2010s was genuinely sophisticated and largely undiscovered by mainstream European tourism. Riga's problem was not overcrowding. Riga's problem was a much older and more structural one. It is losing its population. Latvia has been one of the fastest shrinking countries in Europe for 20 years. Since joining the European Union in 2004, Latvia has lost approximately a quarter of its population to emigration primarily to Western Europe, primarily young and educated people who left for opportunities that a small Baltic economy could not provide. Riga, which had nearly 900,000 residents at its peak in the Soviet era, now has fewer than 630,000, and the number falls every year. A city that is losing its residents is a city that is losing its reason to exist. The shops close not because tourists stopped coming, but because the people who would have shopped in them have moved to Dublin or Berlin or Amsterdam. The restaurants that might have been great never opened because the chef who would have opened them emigrated in 2019. The cultural institutions that might have drawn visitors are underfunded because the tax base has shrunk with the population. Riga is beautiful. Riga is affordable. Riga is accessible. And Riga is quiet in the way that emptied things are quiet. It is not the only Eastern European capital with this problem. Sofia, Vilnius, Tallinn all face versions of the same demographic equation. They are cities that Europe is slowly vacating, not through any dramatic crisis, but through the accumulated individual decisions of hundreds of thousands of people who concluded that their future lay somewhere else. That is a different kind of death than Venice experienced, but it is equally irreversible, and in some ways more honest. The final city on this list requires a different kind of attention. Not because it has been abandoned by tourists, or hollowed out by short-term rentals, or emptied by emigration, but because it represents something that should concern anyone who believes that European cities have a future worth protecting: Paris. Paris is not dying. Let us be precise about that, because imprecision here would be dishonest, and dishonesty is not what this channel does. Paris remains one of the most visited cities on Earth. Its museums, its food culture, its architecture, its fashion industry, its intellectual life, all of it persists, at various levels of health and dysfunction. But there is something happening in Paris that fits the pattern of this list more precisely than most observers have been willing to acknowledge. In 2023 and 2024, around the staging of the Olympic Games, Paris undertook an aggressive campaign to clean up, reform, and remarket itself. The Seine, which had been too polluted for swimming for a century, was cleaned sufficiently for Olympic open water events. Homeless encampments were cleared from the vicinity of major landmarks, cleared meaning dispersed to locations less visible to cameras. The city presented, to the world watching the games, a version of itself that was more beautiful and more coherent than the daily reality that Parisians actually navigated. And then the cameras left. The conversations that Parisians have with each other, not the conversations they have with tourists or journalists, but the ones that happen in apartments and around dinner tables, are conversations about leaving, not in the majority, not even, perhaps, in a plurality, but in a growing segment of educated, middle-class Parisians who have done the calculation and concluded that the cost of living in one of the most beautiful cities in human history is no longer justified by what the city actually delivers, crime that is not decreasing despite official statistics that suggest otherwise, air quality that remains among the worst in Western Europe, a public transport system of genuine quality coexisting with surfaces and spaces that have deteriorated in ways that become visible the moment you step outside the tourist circuits. A sense, described to us by a former employee of a major French cultural institution who now lives in Bordeaux, that Paris stopped belonging to Parisians sometime around 2015, and not enough people have said it out loud yet. The French government spent €9 billion on the Paris Olympics. The tourism numbers that followed were, by the metrics of the tourism industry, impressive. And yet the question that those numbers do not answer is the one that Rome could not answer, that Venice could not answer, that Barcelona is still trying to answer. How do you keep a city alive for the people who live in it, when the economics of global tourism and global real estate have made that a structurally losing proposition? There is a moment in every empire's history when the machinery of its own greatness begins to consume it, when the thing that made it powerful starts extracting more than it gives back. Rome understood this in theory and could not stop it in practice. The British understood it and called it the burden of empire. The cities on this list understood it too, in most cases, and found themselves unable to stop it either. Because the forces at work here, the economics of short-term rental platforms, the mechanics of property investment at scale, the demographic pressures of an aging and emigrating European population, the flattening effect of algorithmic tourism on authentic urban culture, are not forces that any individual city government fully controls. They are systemic. They are the product of decisions made in boardrooms in San Francisco and in investment committees in Luxembourg and in policy rooms in Brussels. And the cities are, in a sense, the places where those decisions land. The 10 cities on this list are not failures. They are case studies in a process that is larger than any of them. A process that is, if the patterns hold, far from complete. The cities that have not yet experienced what Prague experienced, what Bruges experienced, what Lisbon experienced, they are not safe. They are early. And the difference between early and safe is the difference between a city that still has the capacity to act and a city that is already watching its own decline in the mirror, unable to look away. We started with a question dressed as an observation. These are the European capitals that tourists stopped visiting. But the more precise version of that question is harder and more important. It is not about tourism. It is about what European cities are for, who they belong to, and what gets lost when the answer to both of those questions changes without anyone holding a vote. Empires do not fall in a day. They fall in patterns, patterns that look, from inside, like normal life, until the day they do not. Venice's 50,000 remaining residents are living through the end of something that took 500 years to build. The Lisbonites being priced out of Alfama are living through a transformation that took 5 years. The difference in speed does not change the nature of what is being lost. What is being lost is the thing that these cities always were, places where people built something worth seeing. If you want to keep watching the patterns before everyone else recognizes them, subscribe. Empire Falls is documenting the decline that history will remember, and the next chapter is already loading. Tell us in the comments which European city you think falls next. We read every